It doesn't really matter whether something happened in the past or it's something that's been put behind a group of people. When it's that significant, as for instance, being colonized by another country and all of the like horrific things that they went through, it's not something that really goes away from the culture and how people, especially how people communicate, how people cope with situations, the contexts that arise, because everything is driven by what happened before.
Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Dr. Loli Kim is a cross-cultural multimodalist-semanticist-pragmatist specializing in Korea. She received her doctorate in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, specializing in Korean Studies at the University of Oxford, where she is now postdoctoral researcher on the Leverhulme Grant, researching the communication and folklore of Korea's Haenyeo. She publishes widely on Asian communication and cross-cultural analytic frameworks, and was the winner of the Hendrick Hamel Prize in 2023 for innovative contribution to Korean studies in her book Understanding Korean Film: A Cross-Cultural Perspective. Loli is also the editor and co-visionary behind Bloomsbury's Foodscaping Asia series and assistant editor of the European Journal of Korean Studies. Thank you, Loli. So I'm going to jump to the questions right away. I was looking over your website, very impressive. And one section that struck me was, and I'm going to read now, my primary interest is in cross-cultural untranslatability, be it linguistic, gestural, semiotic, or intertextual, and in shedding light on culturally contextualized meaning in texts, either in analysis or the development of methodologies for doing so. There's a lot there. I was struck by this term, cross-cultural untranslatability. And when I try to think about that term, I wondered, in my field, we use the term cultural equivalence to talk about how certain constructs in psychology can or cannot translate across cultures or not equal across cultures. Is that sort of the idea behind the term cross-cultural untranslatability, or is there a different way to think about that? And then the other part to my question only is, I understand the linguistic aspect of language, but gestural, semiotic, or intertextual, could you give some examples of what that might look like in the Korean context?
Yeah, so I think
Mm,
cross-cultural untranslatability is like an umbrella within which your definition exists.
mm,
I mean, yeah, I would say actually it's basically the same, but there's
mm,
just so many different kinds of cross-cultural
mm,
untranslatability and so
mm,
many different cross cultures happening within that. Could be, because many people just think, oh, okay, it's the two cultures that are present. Let's say recently I was analyzing a French Korean movie called Je suis là,
mm,
and in the film you've got a South Korean woman and a French man, but and some other characters, and they speak in Korean, French, and English in the
mm.
film. Now, English isn't actually any of their local languages. It's something they use to kind of trans language to get meaning across, because I think they're kind of insecure about maybe the ability of their own language to do that because
Wow.
of the misunderstandings happening.
Mm,
And most people say, well, that's a South Korean and a French person, and those are the cultures and languages we're dealing with. But it's really not, because then we're dealing with the relations between, for instance, France and England, and
mm.
how they use the English language to convey things, and whether there's any kind of nuance or undertone to that, which sometimes there is. And there's all, within that, there's so many different things to consider.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say it's the same, but the way I've been dealing with it is trying to break down all of these different
Yeah. The
bits.
different, I mean, you didn't use the word, but I think you're describing even the power dynamics are important to think about. When you have a French person and a Korean person, but they're relying on English as sort of that language to communicate, I think it kind of speaks to the power that's associated with the English language, the privilege
Mm.
that's afforded to the English language.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that I mean, just and the use of English itself. I mean, from my analysis of that particular film, the meaning that's lost because the meaning of let's say the French person is speaking in English,
Mm.
and what they're trying to say in French, when they say it in English, loses something in French. So that meaning never gets across. And when the person who's Korean is speaking back and they're using English, certain meaning is lost. But the meanings that are lost are very particular and different. And had they been in the other person's language, it wouldn't have been the same.
Right.
I mean, and it's just it's incredibly complex, and it makes you kind of wonder if when you meet someone who's from somewhere else, if they ever really know, if they ever really understand you.
Right, right. That's fascinating that even the type of meaning that gets lost differs based on the language. That's what you're saying. Between the French and the Korean, that
Yeah.
losing of meaning when you use English might be different depending on whether your original language is Korean or French.
Yeah.
Yeah. This idea of analyzing film, it seems like that's something that you do a lot. I know you mentioned the French film. I'm curious
Mhm.
if there are other examples of films that you've looked at that my listeners might know about, given how, as you know, like popular Korean culture is around the world. But are there like movies that you might have analyzed from that perspective that listeners might know about? Yeah.
I mean, I've analyzed hundreds of films. I would say similar to that. I mean, if we're
Yeah.
going to pick a similar example, A Korean in Paris is one very slow moving and sad film about a man who goes to Paris with his wife and
Mm,
she just disappears. And the film doesn't really explain why.
mm,
And, it's not like a thriller where they call the police and everyone's looking for the killer.
mm,
He just searches Paris for her. And throughout the film, you just see this really, it's like cross cultural tension built up as he communicates with different people.
mm,
And again, like, the English language seems to be this common factor that occasionally
mhm,
gets pulled out to communicate. But I would say that's quite an interesting film if people are interested specifically in French and Korean,
mm,
and especially cross culture and
mm,
how that comes out in context and behaviors as well as language, because the contexts that things are happening in are very particular. Those contexts, the situations themselves don't always exist in either culture. And then within those situations, you've got this whole kind of multimodal articulation of things. So it's hard to let me think of an example. There's a kind of I've noticed that French
mm.
people tend to be more, let's say, and this term isn't used to be offensive, it's used just because it's the only word I can think of, physically invasive.
Mm,
And not because they're trying to get, in somebody's space, but their behavior and gesture, just holding out a cigarette and passing it to somebody, who's at a
mm,
bar to
mm,
share with you, or touching somebody on the shoulder, something that would make Koreans, especially maybe older Koreans, quite uncomfortable,
mm.
whereas French people are kind of more like that. I mean, you see a lot of that, so in some scenes there's no talking at all, just somebody
Yeah.
leans over and hands the guy a cigarette, and gradually you see him kind of falling apart throughout the film and more taking part in this strange culture.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's one example.
That's fascinating because even the idea of a different level of comfort with physical touch, like you said,
Mm,
or as Korean American, when I travel to Korea, I feel like sometimes the norms in Korea are very different compared to in the US when it
mm,
comes to physical invasion of each other's space. I feel like in Korea, compared to the US, there's much more openness to that. But you're saying, again, that's all relative because in this film comparison, you're saying that, like in the French context, you might have seen even more examples of like intruding into other space.
mm. Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, I think there's subtle kind of differences
mm,
in that there in France there's no cool dynamics that are kind of
yes.
amounting to whatever meaning it equals.
Yeah.
So obviously I see it happening in Korea as well, but
Mm,
there's very specific meanings that, as you know,
yeah.
arise
Hmm.
depending on who's doing it to who, where,
Yeah.
and whether that's, because you can do something that could be seen as caring, but if you've just done something to somebody that's completely unkind or disloyal, it could be seen as sarcastic. Or whereas in France, I think there's none of that. It's completely just one-on-one, and you see that in the language as well.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We'll talk more about the hierarchical culture that's Korea and how that manifests in language. When I teach cross-cultural psychology, Loli, we have a topic on communication or we have a chapter on communication. And in that chapter, there's quite a bit of energy spent on low context versus high context communication and how there are cross-cultural differences. And I know that from someone like you who studies these kinds of stuff, that's maybe like a very umbrella kind of terminology, maybe like individualism and collectivism. But can you speak a little bit to how you sort of unpack the low context versus high context communication styles in your research?
Mm.
And another way, Loli, to think about it might be like, do you think Korea is truly a high context culture? Or what are some nuances that you can see that is kind of going beyond that generalization that Korea is high context culture? Because we often talk about Korea as being, very hierarchical. It's all about nunchi. Yeah. Do you see in your research some examples of that and counterexamples?
I was just looking at my notes. So the way that I primarily look at this is from a kind of socio-pragmatic perspective. So whereas in English or in my own life, we're much more kind of direct and this is the information XYZ.
Yeah.
Whereas what I find with Koreans in my personal life, because I'm married to a Korean and also in my work, is that there's an incredible amount and it actually doesn't need to be said if you know what the context is, and again, what the social dynamic is, and as you said, have nunchi and be concerned about other people's anshim based on their age, whoever's there, and also the 분위기, like what's happening in that right now. So I tend to look at it from that perspective mostly, and that's where I've had the most trouble in general. And I think in my life communicating with Koreans, or at least not anymore, but in the beginning, because I think when I met my husband, I was early 20s. And it was over 10 years ago now, and I didn't know what nunchi was. I didn't know what the 분위기 is, what this atmosphere is and the fact that the atmosphere is completely directed by socio-pragmatics. It's not like, oh, how are people feeling? It's how old are people, or what's the relation, and based on that, how should you behave? And if you're not, what implication could that have? And not only on them, but then on everybody else. And it's incredibly intricate. And that, I mean, it leads to all kinds of situations which, for speaking as an English person, that are very confusing. For instance, the first time I went to Korea, I arrived at my parents-in-law's house, where my sister-in-law was also there, and it was my first time meeting them. And I remember there was a very lengthy discussion about where we'd all sit at the dinner table. Yeah, and I was so confused. I was thinking, we're just going to grab a chair, we're going to sit down, and it went on for quite a while. And I think my husband got quite frustrated as well, because he is aware that I really didn't understand. And and he would say, oh, they're just being really Korean. They're just being really Korean. And I would think, I don't know what that means, but I guess, they're very conscientious about things.
Yeah.
And there, there's so many situations like that. Just a few days ago, we went to a restaurant with my PhD supervisor and my parents and my husband. And we spent 30 minutes before my supervisor got there, kind of playing musical chairs, debating where everyone should sit according to.
Yeah. I,
You must have so many examples like this as well.
I mean, I can totally relate to that. I share with my students that when I went out to dinner I spent some time in Korea with Korean colleagues teaching in a
Mm,
psychology department. And I made the mistake of one day when we went out to dinner, I sat down first. I realized everyone else was just standing around waiting for the most senior person to sit. And then based on that,
mm,
using nunchi, you would situate yourself around the table.
mm.
But I think it just seems so inefficient to the Western mind to think about, oh, like, why do we need to spend so much time figuring out where we're going to sit? But I think that part of efficiency versus honoring those who are older or in more positions of power is what's at tension here, where, like you said, yeah, it seems like it's a lot of time spent on conversing about where people will sit, but on the other hand, might be necessary so that the elders are properly honored. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's even, have you found that, I mean, having nunchi is often more important than telling the truth.
Mhm.
So you get, companies or departments, let's say, which have like really horrific problems because they can't really get things done. And it's because mostly what they have to think about is nunchi rather
Yeah,
than, I need you to do XYZ task. And that in the indirectness leads to so many problems, but then nobody can say, oh, you've made a mistake because
right.
you're senior to me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then I hear about the generational shifts in Korea when it comes to that type of communication style and how that could lead to conflicts between the older generation and the younger generation. I mean, that type of conflict, I guess, is in some ways universal. In any kind of workplace, there's a generational conflict, but in Korea, it's specifically because the younger generation is deemed to not have nunchi or to have little nunchi, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can feel as well how, I mean, I'm British, but I can feel having lived in my husband's culture for 10 years. And, I'm a woman married to a man. It's very different than a man being married to a woman because, I mean, you've probably heard the phrase that if a, a man, Korean man marries a Western woman, she becomes Korean. If a Korean woman marries a Western man, it's like she's no longer Korean. This kind of idea that she's
Yeah.
like gone. Yeah. So I I've had to do a lot of changing, a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
reorganizing of my own thinking in order just to survive, because otherwise you're
Right.
just constantly in trouble and constantly feeling bad about yourself and wondering what am I doing wrong? And
Right.
I've completely lost my trail of thought now in my complaining.
No,
Whatever.
you're
Right.
fine. I think you're highlighting, Loli, the importance of also nunchi as a skill, not just a posture, meaning nunchi is
Mm,
not just an internal thing where you kind of assess a situation, but there's an action that follows. I think you use the word socio-pragmatic, that you are
mm,
doing something in response to your assessment of what's needed. So it's not just,
mm,
oh, I perceive that there's a need where people
mhm.
have to serve this elderly person, but I'm actually
Yeah.
going to serve this person. And in Korea, again, that's viewed as a skill set. I'm curious because it's so fascinating to talk to you about this, but in your opinion, do you think nunchi is a uniquely Korean idea? I know that the word nunchi
Mm.
doesn't translate well into the English language, for example, right? But I've also heard people say maybe it's not unique, but it's just, I guess, emphasized more in Korea. Or other people will say it is unique to Korea in the way that it's felt, in the way that it's expressed. What is your opinion on that?
I mean, I think it's definitely unique to Korea. I mean, but I understand that there are concepts that
Yeah.
have more
Hmm.
similarity in, East Asia
Mm.
than, for instance, to what we have in England. But based on what I know about the Korean hierarchical system and how that affects language and behavior and, how everything kind of orchestrates, Japan simply doesn't have that level of hierarchy that
Mm.
would cause like nunchi to be used in the same way. So whether they have a relatable concept or not, it's kind of irrelevant once you know that, because that requires the nunchi, as we talked about before, to be a priority, even above like the success of a department, a business becoming bankrupt. Like, well, we can't tell the boss that what he's doing is wrong because he's the boss, even if the company completely disintegrates. So yeah, so I would say it's 100% unique. It's very complex. I mean, I'm still always learning. It's a skill set that requires you to be. I mean, we're constantly interpreting things all the time. You know, when we watch people, their body language, the way they speak, and we're making assessments all the time because we want to. I suppose as humans, we want to be safe, we want to be liked, and all these kind of basic things. So we do that, but with Nunchi, all of the things are linked back to the social pragmatics of the situation. And then there's such delicate considerations. I mean, I wouldn't say English people are heartless, but there's a certain amount of a certain kind of, oh, well, better luck next time kind of thing. And there's an acceptance of that. And there's a feeling of people don't have to always be perfect to me. And I have to accept that. And that doesn't mean I don't have to like them or get along with them. I mean, at least for me and for a lot of people that I know, this is going to be some different people. But for Koreans, I really don't think it's like that. And when they are senior, and there is some reason, even if they are not senior, but they are related to a person who is senior in some kind of important way. It's incredibly complex. And I mean, until this day, I have various small little misunderstandings that happen, and afterwards I just feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this thing, because it's genuinely upsetting because they're raised in this particular culture, just like for me, I'm raised here. So
No, I think that's well put, that it's incredibly complex because Dunchi can be understood in so many different ways and sometimes in contradictory ways. I know we talked about how Dunchi makes sometimes workplaces inefficient because you have to cater to the oldest person or the most senior person, even if they're wrong. But also sometimes Nunchi is contradictorily viewed as the thing that makes somebody a really good worker, a hard worker. Like, oh, like in Korean, they might say 눈치 빠르다, like that person has fast 눈치 and they're able to get stuff done. And so because of that, I guess, sort of contradictory elements, I just feel like 눈치 is such a difficult and also fascinating concept to think about. Similar line of conversation about Han. Han is something that, again, I'm thinking a lot about because as a psychologist, I study, among other things, trauma. And Han is sometimes understood as like a collective trauma of a group of people or a nation like Korea. But I feel like collective trauma is only getting at a part of what Han is about. And so I know Han especially is something that is expressed through the arts, including film, including music. And so I'm just curious about your experience, Loli, in studying language of Han and analyzing films and other media that express Han.
Well, but just before I start, I wonder what else you think it's about.
So collective trauma, but I think Han is also this sort of bitterness that it's almost like a sense of revenge that you harbor within you. And you use that as energy to motivate. And using the term, I mean, thinking about the colonial period where if you think about what Korean people experience as a result of the colonial period from Japan, using that sort of bitterness, that pain of oppression as energy to overcome. I think that is maybe another way to think about Han.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe it was going to be something that I'd like not like considered, but I completely agree with that. I mean, I actually did a talk on that. I mean, when I was maybe first year of my PhD study, because I love Korean revenge films, and I found it really interesting that they seem to like making them. And
they're so dark too, right? They're so dark.
They're so, they've changed cinema
Mm.
around the like
Mhm.
changed the face of cinema. And you when you think about, oh, I want to watch a really sick film, something that's really dark and makes me feel uncomfortable. Many people think, okay, what about a Korean film? What about Old Boy? What about
Mm.
And there's something in that when people keep trying to act out a certain thing.
Yeah.
And I also thought that was a kind of expression of that you also see in society with things like Han, this
Mm.
like this need to kind of get it out. And as you said as well, which I also agree, it was kind of, it wasn't a positive thing, but when some, like, let's say if you're at school and someone's bullying you for a long time, and they're telling you you're this or you're that, something low, then it can fuel you to really be the opposite of that. It can
Mm.
really give you momentum, energy, and drive, and
Mm.
all of these things. So I also kind of felt like that. It's like almost like a nationalism.
Mm.
But Han is, apart from that presentation I did, it's something that I have written on less. And one of the reasons is that when I gave that presentation,
Mm.
I found that Korean scholars didn't like me talking about Han.
Mm. Why
And
was
I'm
that?
not, why, I
Why
mean,
was that? Yeah.
I, I didn't know there wasn't that many papers written on it, or things written on it, really. There were some,
Mm.
but there seemed to be this idea that it was a sensitive topic that
Mm.
it's something that can't really be defined. And it's also something that lots of people have different opinions on. So, and I think maybe also because perhaps because I'm not Korean. And
Mm.
so how should I know about this? Which is understandable. But ever since then, apart from in my fictional works where, I'm kind of free to do whatever I want,
Yeah.
I've tried to not talk about it too much.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I feel like when I've tried to engage the topic of Han as a Korean American, I've gotten maybe some similar sentiments as what you're describing, Loli, where it's almost like Korean folks, they want to move past Han. They want to say that Han is not something that is relevant for this generation, that it's
Mm.
something that might have been true in the past. And when they say that, they typically talk about not only the colonial period, but also post-Korean War, where there's just a lot of poverty, but Korea is no longer a poor country. And so to be able to, I think then Korean scholars are like, we should stop talking about Han because it's a thing of the past. What's interesting to me is that so many Korean American scholars are going back to their Korean roots and thinking about Han. And there's so many people who have written about that. And then like you, Loli, who as somebody who is not Korean studying this topic, I think in my mind, that's something that is really important that as long as we approach it the right way and in a respectful way, I feel like it's something that should be studied. And also, I think I'm trying to make the claim that Han is something that has lessons for outside of the Korean context, that there are things
Mm.
that we can think about that can serve non-Korean communities as well, not just the Korean community. So I think that's sort of the claim that I'm trying to make, which is there are things to think about for non-Koreans that are lessons associated with Han.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And also from a communicative perspective, one of the things which I write about a lot is the importance of this cross-cultural perspective, whether it's a researcher or, whatever. I read this once in the work of Paul Willerman, who's a really wonderful academic who writes on
Mm.
cross-cultural stuff.
Mm.
And he talks about how if you approach a particular analysis, just you, and you're just analyzing this thing from another culture, I think he called it like a cross-border raid or something. Like you can't just, you can't just do that and expect to get anything back except your own opinion. I mean, you're not really learning anything.
Mm.
So we really have to approach things just across the board, cross-culturally. And if we're going to do that, then
Mm.
these things that are in the chasm between cultures, these is like we're going to start with the the biggest things first, and things like Han,
Mm.
Nunxi,
Mhm.
Anxim, Hushim. I
Yeah.
mean, these things are incredible. I
Mhm.
mean, like when I read about them, I'm just it blows my mind because I don't have these things in my culture. I find them incredibly interesting.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter really. I mean, and this isn't me saying that what Koreans think about, talking about Han is wrong, but it doesn't really matter whether something happened in the past or it's something that's been put behind a group of people when it's that significant as, for instance, being colonized by another country and all of the like horrific things that they went through. It's not something that really goes away from the culture and how people, especially how people communicate, how people cope with situations, the contexts that arise, because everything is driven by what happened before.
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah, I think it's incredibly important
Yeah,
from that perspective.
I agree. And I also think about, again, the sadness in younger generation maybe losing that sort of memory of Han and maybe understanding it from an academic perspective, but not necessarily being able to feel it as maybe the older generation did. And I think I do agree, Loli, that some people who criticize the idea of Han, how it's talked about, they're coming from the perspective of, well, Koreans are not the only ones who experience collective trauma. That I
Mm,
think there's a very important statement to make and an obvious statement to make that Korea as a country is not the only country that has experienced collective angst or collective trauma. And so when Han is portrayed as sort of only Korean or uniquely Korean, I think that's the part that I think we need to do better in portraying as otherwise. But I do think there
mm,
are unique sort of expressions of Han that we can talk about in Korea. But it's
mm,
not certainly only felt in Korea, as
mm,
sometimes we are prone to sort of think about. Yeah.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But also getting hung up on
Mm.
terminology, because
Mm.
I find that, it doesn't just happen when like talking about, for instance, Korea or
Mm.
Japan or, regions, but even especially between academics, if you get people from slightly different fields looking at each other's work and they're basically talking about the same thing, but there's different terminology and the amount of arguments that come out about which terminology you're using. And it really doesn't matter because what we're really trying to talk about is, let's say, the experience that Korea's had and how that's manifested in society in a particularly through their culture. And it is important that, that there's stories and experiences and the particular cultural specificities of that
Mhm.
are told. And that also starts conversations about things like representation, because if
Mm.
we say, okay, we're not going to talk about Han because that's making this out to be a particularly Korean thing, then if we just talk about everyone, marginalized
Mhm.
voices that you find, especially in Korea, they could then be even given even less spotlight. And I recently
That's
wrote
right.
a book for Cambridge University Press, which is it's not released yet, but I wrote it with Jean Kia
Mm.
on East Asian voices in English children's picture books.
Hmm.
We analyzed data of about 3,000 books from one library.
Wow.
We did some others as well, but that was just one of them. And it was since 1800 and something until now.
Mm.
And Korean representation was minute. I mean,
Mm.
compared to Chinese, for instance,
Wow.
Japanese was slightly better, but it was really, and I mean, even in the 90s where it kind of picked up for a minute, it was still nothing compared to Chinese representation. Obviously, that's just one data, but we've kind of seen it across the board in
Mhm.
in texts and also in. I mean, you also see it in research of things like, for instance, Korean film.
Yeah.
I read one once, which was a German perspective, and it really had nothing to do with Korea.
Wow.
It was just an analysis of the film.
Mm. Mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
linking that back to Han, because I
Yeah.
digressed a bit, it's like the same thing. If we don't speak through this particular
Yeah.
scope and address the bit in between the cultures, we might be losing something as well.
No, it's really powerful. I'm like making mental notes slowly because here's yet another
Sorry, I'm
argument.
just like blah, 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 blah.
No, this is another argument for studying Han. It
Mm,
matters for representation. Let's talk about Jeong. That's another area that I'm
okay.
thinking a lot about as a psychologist because,
Mm,
again, as you know, Jeong doesn't have an equivalent in the English language, but we can kind of describe it as a deep bond between people. We can describe it as using the Korean phrase like 끈끈한 관계, like sticky relationship. So we can kind of capture it, but in your scholarship, how have you seen Jeong come through, for example, in your research data or how you think about Jeong? Yeah.
John. Right. So,
Or maybe even in your personal experiences too. I know you've shared with my listeners about your family and how you've had experience interacting with your husband's family members. Like, I'm
yeah.
sure that Jeong comes into play as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. John links. So, I mean, this is one of the kind of complicated things that I couldn't really get my head around
Mm,
and at first because we have friends here, we have colleagues, people that we're close to, people that we do things for, but it's very much if you're close to someone, you might do more because it's less of an imposition because of the intimacy factor. But then with Korean people, you've also got, I suppose, we've been in the same organization as each other, or we are from the same place, which we
mhm.
also get in England. If you're outside of the country and you bump into someone and they're from
Yeah.
England, suddenly you're like best friends. But with Koreans, it's just on another level. And I remember when I first married my husband,
Mm,
and we were constantly having visitors like just show up and people we had to show around and
wow.
favors that we had to do. And
Mhm,
I remember one of his professors from maybe his undergraduate degree had a daughter who came to the UK, and we had to go to London and show her around for a few days. Now, this does not happen in England.
mm,
No, I mean, first of all, we never see our teachers again. I mean, if we had
yeah.
that kind of like wonderful bond, it might be written about in a book 10 years later or something,
Mm,
because it would be considered this touching story of a special relationship that never should have happened because our culture just doesn't make
yeah.
room for that. I don't know if
Mm,
it's the same in the US between
mhm,
teachers and kids, but when you leave school at the end of the day, they're lucky to see the back of you and they're not
mm,
going to involve their families
mm.
with you. You might not even know well, actually, you would know if they're married, maybe if they're Mrs. But you wouldn't really know much about them. Just,
Right.
they're like a piece of furniture, except for they speak and they teach us things.
Wow.
And that's how I expect to be
Mm,
treated when I teach in a school as
mm,
well. I
mm,
mean, it depends on personality. Maybe you would want to be more involved if you had some kind of soft spot for a student or they're in a difficult situation. Somehow this kind of Sandra Bullock blindside style
mm.
relationship blossomed. I don't know. It can happen, but it's just these things just don't happen here.
Yeah.
And I found it at first just really confusing. I felt like
Mm,
something's wrong here.
mm,
Something is going on. I don't know what it is, but
mhm,
like, maybe my husband didn't want to spend so much time with me. He wanted to like have go
mm,
out and do things and not be kind of like tied down to our boring routine. He wanted to go have his friends a lot or whatever. But no,
mm.
he actually had to go to these things and
Yeah.
had to do these, certain favors. And now I basically morphed into him. So I find
Mm,
myself making these links and then feeling obliged, and then it's not even obliged,
mm.
it's just what you do.
Yeah.
And the relationship lasts forever. It's amazing. I
It is. I think I'm picking up on some really important terms or phrases that you're using, including obligation, that in our
mm,
individualistic US context, we don't typically think about relationships as obligations. But in Korea, if you have Jeong for someone, through thick and thin, you're supposed to be there for them. Like you said,
mm,
last forever. And sometimes that could lead to some really slippery slopes because
mm,
you might actually be doing things that personally you don't feel comfortable doing, but
mm,
because of 정 때문에 you're
mm,
doing something for the other person. And this is where we get into trouble with, like people, I don't know, hiding things, cults that like in the name of Jeong kind of, not speak up, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Mm.
So there are downsides to Jeong, but I think this idea of relationships being obligations and you have a responsibility to another person is a really good understanding, Loli, that you're expressing about Jeong. I also think about Jeong from a boundary perspective, where early on you talked about like that film where there's physical invasion of another person's space. Jeong is all about sort of that permeable boundaries in relationships where, like you mentioned, maybe in England, teachers might have a very clear boundary between themselves and the students. I think in the US too, that's the case. But in Korea, there might be more fluid boundaries that, again, for better or for worse, might be because of Jeong, right? Where, like in Korea, one practical example of that is people share their cell phone numbers all the time. In the US, I think we're very clear about who we share our cell phone numbers with. Right? We wouldn't typically share our cell numbers with our students. But in
Yeah.
Korea, I see my colleagues sharing their numbers with their students all the time. So,
Oh my God, yeah. It would be inappropriate, right? Because there's like, it's something to do with ethics as
mhm,
well.
mhm,
And, also if you do share your number, let's say you even do it with all of them, so there's no favoritism,
yeah,
then you would expect the children to start misbehaving. I mean, that's
mm,
also partly because English children, maybe American children too, have a lot of attitude, and there's not this, again, respect culture, stay quiet in class, listen, do what you're supposed to do. So there's fear involved with it.
mm,
But
yeah,
but yeah, it's just insane to me. When I first heard my husband say it, I was like, who are you messaging? Who are you messaging? Like being nosy. And then he said, my teacher from high school. And I'm like, what? And the teacher put like love hearts. And that was confusing as well.
mm,
Because,
yeah,
an adult male sending love hearts to a young male student, it's just not something that I'm familiar with. But
right,
that also turns out to be something that just really older people can do. And it doesn't mean anything bad.
right, right. It's again, part of Jeong, right? Their expression of Jeong for their
Yeah.
former student. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That's
Um,
also relevant to their generation and hierarchy and
yeah,
everything else that's going on in this orchestration of communication and thought and everything. It's yeah.
yeah. There's I don't know if when you visited Korea, if you ever had a chance to go to 찜질방 or Korean spas or public bathhouses, but
I've avoided it.
so I take American students to Korea for a study abroad program, and I always make that something like an optional activity they can try out on their own. And one year, my students were really brave in trying that out, going to a 찜질방, and to their credit, they kind of connected that experience to the idea of Jeong, which is there's a different level of intimacy when you can take a bath together, literally like bathe together in a large bathing tub in a way that made them feel very uncomfortable, but also allow them to feel that sense of Jeong for one another. Again, that
Mm,
kind of boundary crossing that Jeong entails. So I like to
mm.
use that example as well, the bathtub experience of my students.
Yeah, that's. I think Koreans in particular like these kind of experiences. Like they like to drink
Yeah.
and get so drunk that they tell all of their secrets.
Yes.
It's this uncomfortableness. So get so drunk and then talk about things that you should never ever talk about. I don't know
Right.
whether it's just with my Korean friends, but I mean, yeah, and humiliate yourself, sleep in the street. I know that my
Mhm.
husband, when he was a student, he'd meet up with his friends and they'd drink so much
Mm.
that, I mean, and I know that that's very typical of sports university students,
Mm.
but these kind of slightly humiliating
Yeah.
bonding experiences. It's like once we've done this, we're like blood brothers. This kind of,
Yeah.
not that that's such a Western idea, but
It's like almost a fraternity that
mm,
we talk about in the US on college campuses where you've gone through a very embarrassing experience together, like you said. And
yeah, yeah,
we kind of, yeah, keep it as like keep it between us, right?
Yeah, this is all impossible in England because we're, way too like formal and awkward
Mm,
and like uncomfortable by everything. And everyone's, we can't have a public bath here. People will
mm,
just freak out.
yeah, in the US too. Although
Oh, really?
in some cases, in Korean communities in the US, they
I
become
heard there is some.
popular. Yeah, yeah. And I
Really?
think it overlaps with, I mean, this is a total aside, but some European cultures where they do enjoy public
Mm,
baths. So,
like
like,
Germany.
yeah, or like, I think Russian communities here also enjoy it as well. So I see,
Wow.
yeah, some overlap there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that
hmm
Russian did that as well.
Yeah.
But I think
Um,
Koreans don't go with their like parents-in-law, like which I heard in Germany. I think they actually like with parents-in-laws, they even go to the spa, and there's no
oh,
separate genders.
right. In
Yeah,
Korea, clearly they divide by biological
yeah,
sex. Yeah.
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 That
Yeah.
would be like a horrific thing that no one could ever forget.
Right. 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 Yeah. Well, this is so fascinating. I really appreciate the stories that you're sharing, Loli. I know that your current role right now is as a postdoc, which I'm
Yep.
guessing is primarily doing research. I mean, you've written so many books already, and I'm sure there are some differences, but my understanding of a postdoc position is primarily focused on research. But
Mm,
as a postdoc, do you also get to teach students, or do you get to teach classes at Oxford, for example, or
mm.
any surrounding universities where you get to teach students about these aspects of Korean language? And if so, like, what has that experience been like for you to be able to teach students about these topics? Like, is there maybe like a something that went well for you, or maybe like a learning experience where, oh, I tried this and it didn't go as well?
Well, yeah. So
Yeah.
in the UK,
Mm,
actually, PhD students can also teach
okay.
at the university where they study.
Mm,
I didn't get a chance to do it during my PhD because I sort of focused more on like on the publication side of things.
sure.
And my first teaching here will be this May. So
Mm, mm,
yeah, and I'll be teaching. These are all separate subjects,
yeah.
all based in Korea: politics, sociology, popular culture. It's two more. I can't remember, but so all different, yeah, all different ones, which
Yeah.
I have to study for. And I will, I mean, just purely because I have to in order to stand up in front of them for an hour, I will be pulling out things
Yeah.
on subjects. And I'm
Yeah.
of course terrified that they'll tear me apart, but hopefully it'll be okay.
That's
Mm.
a lot of classes that you have to prep for. Those will be, I mean, you have materials, but like
But yeah, I'm not
first time you're putting
specifically.
those classes together. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's really daunting, but I think it's an amazing opportunity
Mm,
because when you're in one little nook, and you're not just in one, like say for instance Korean linguistics, you'll also have here we don't have like we even undergraduates, we don't have like all of these different specialties or whatever it is happening all at
mhm,
once. I know there's a lot of different subjects being covered in US universities, so we start off from quite a focused point, what feels broad to me now, but
mm,
what at the point is very focused, and just continue to get more and more, drilling down further and further.
right.
So then straying from that, as time goes on, straying from that into anything becomes difficult. It becomes
Mm,
like unknown territory.
yeah.
So yeah, being able to teach all these different subjects, which I mean, I imagine I'll be a bit bald afterwards because I'll have been losing hair and getting stressed out. But it will then it will merge with what I've got already, and I'll start being able to talk about things in different contexts
Mm,
using the knowledge that I
yeah.
that I have that I couldn't before. So hopefully,
But
fingers crossed.
to be able to talk to English students about Korea, again, I think I'm really encouraged that there are people like you who do that. Lily, I know that you've already shared about your personal connections to Korean
Yeah.
culture, but if you feel comfortable, can you say a bit more about how you got interested in this area of scholarship? And Obviously, you didn't grow up in Korea. Is that
Mm.
correct?
Yeah.
Like, what is your connection to Korea? How did you get interested in Korean culture? And any professional or personal stories that you're willing to share? Yeah.
My
Mm,
sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is Taiwanese,
I
and yeah, and I'm 10 years younger than him, 12 years younger than my other brother. So when I was a child or like early teens, I first, met my sister-in-law, and I kind of grew up with her being there. And she's lived in the UK for all these years and has given me a complete education on all aspects of kind of Taiwanese culture. So I was already exposed to that, because I'm very close to them. So everything from the food to the various different celebrations that happen each year. I did a course in Mandarin, though it was a very basic course, and that was when I was a teenager. And firstly, it stimulated my interest, but it also made it very familiar.
mm,
So it didn't feel like I was trying to kind of go on an adventure. It felt very natural
right.
to like explore these themes more. And then that same brother, when I was, my 20s, and I was really kind of looking for a direction in my life because I was originally a graphic designer,
Mm,
and I kind of did that straight after coming out of school while I was working out what I wanted to do. And he said, "Well, why don't you go and study Japanese?
mm,
Because you're so interested." I was interested in Japanese cinema and
mhm,
culture at that time. I just kind of moved on from Chinese culture into Japanese culture. I was working my way around.
mm,
And so I did this course, and while I was doing it, I I wanted to go to this language exchange. I got to the point where I was like, okay, I need to test this. I need
mm,
to I need to throw this at some people and see whether I'm actually saying it correctly or not,
mm,
because I'd been kind of spending a lot of time alone focusing on it. And when I went there, I met my husband, who's a Korean, and
mm.
he said, why don't you come out with me and I'll teach you Korean?" And I was like, but that's not kind of what I'm doing right now.
Right.
Anyway, he persuaded me,
Mm.
and here I am. Yeah.
Gotcha, gotcha. So there's a sort of a natural progression where, like you said,
Mm.
you're making your way around different East Asian languages, and then the personal connection that led you into this interest. So thanks for sharing that. Really fascinating because when I look over your materials online, like I don't necessarily see this part of that. And so to be able to hear the personal connection, it's really valuable. So thank you. There are two questions, Loli, that I ask all my guests.
Yeah.
Let me direct them to you, and then that will take us to the end of our time. If you had one advice for a new graduate student who is thinking about career in academia or a new faculty, and let's imagine that they're interested in Korea, studying various aspects of Korea, what
Mm.
might it be? What advice might you have for someone interested in Korea as somebody who is an academic?
Do you mean in terms of kind of how to be how to kind of move successfully in that career path, or do you
Yeah,
mean more like what part or aspect of it to
yeah.
choose study?
More the former, I think. Like, how do you navigate that career path well? Um,
Okay. Well, because you're obviously in academia, you're aware of the politics
mhm, mhm,
and the marginalization of
mm,
Korean studies around
yeah.
the world, especially in the UK.
Mm,
Major universities, the kind of
mm,
universities that people really want to go to, don't
mm,
have Korean courses that are just Korean. It's always Japanese with like a little
mm,
sprinkle of Korean, or Chinese with a sprinkle of Korean, which I find completely frustrating. And not just from the perspective of somebody who, from the fact that we can't get tenure because there are none, but
mm,
also because there just isn't the investment and facilities for people who want to learn Korean. And you really,
mm,
with a language like that, and as we've just spoken about, the cross-cultural difference, which
mm,
requires so much study on the socio-pragmatics and the
yeah.
culture and the history and Han and all of these various things that come into play, that you just can't do if most of the time you're studying Japanese or Chinese, and then you're
Mhm,
just, doing a bit of that. So anyone who's coming into study, and especially those who are looking at an academic career, they're firstly going to be confronted with the fact that it's incredibly competitive. You might see a lot of Korean study students out there, whether it's like something and Korean or whatever. But the amount of those who end up being Korean studies academics may not be, it may not be all of them. And the advice I would give them for competing so that they can be one of them, I'd give this actually to any academic, but I would say especially in these small kind of closed communities, when you're going to postgraduate study, because that's the final kind of sprint, you need to very carefully choose your supervisor. And it's not because it's not because there's better supervisors as such, but where the supervisor is, the amount of publications they've got, the subjects they're writing on, how well they're received, all of these things will ultimately be the driving factor, funding being the main thing. So you want to get a university which is as good as possible, because they will have the most funding, and a supervisor who is well known so that they have some power in order to kind of lift you up. I've been extremely fortunate to have Jeong as my supervisor, and then my longtime she's absolutely amazing. And she doesn't just have access to the, amenities that you need. She also has, which the supervisor needs to have, incredible passion. This is her hobby. So day, night, weekend, there's things going on. She isn't unreachable, and she's very much involved in every aspect of everything. So you really get things done. One of the first things she said to me the first day I met her was, "So do you want to be an academic after this, PhD?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Okay, so we need to publish, publish, publish." And straight away, she knows what direction we're going in. She knows how to get it done. And she ensured that all of those boxes were ticked. Obviously, the student has to want it too. They have to be actually doing the work, but you need that.
I think that comment about the supervisor and the resources, and of course, not only the ability of the supervisor, but also their openness to sharing those abilities, those resources with you. I think that's such important advice, that you want to meet someone who is well published, but also willing to share in that process of publishing together. I think is an advice that I'm hearing from you. I've heard from other folks as well. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think another thing which is helpful is interdisciplinary route, because, for instance, I'm technically a multimodalist. So I began with multimodality before I was doing Korean analysis, but I was a multimodalist. So I was in film studies and film production. I studied at Pimer Studios. I used Korean scripts, films, translation of book to screen of Korean books. I did all of those things, but I wasn't in the Korean studies department. Now, I'm not suggesting that somebody does a different course then goes into Korean studies, because that was really difficult for me. But if once you're in there, if you have a particular medium that you use for analysis, for instance, I use film, so I can quite easily just like slide over into the film department. And if you do the right research in that area, so you're not just analyzing Korean language in film, for instance, but you're actually studying the basics of film theory and analysis, etc. And if you're looking at linguistics, but I'm also looking at gesture. I also look at history and culture because I have to contextualize it. Then when it comes to job applications and going from postdoc to postdoc, which is what most researchers have to do, sometimes they're doing it. I know some researchers who've been doing it for 20 years and they're still not they're still not in tenured positions, because not all of us want to move to different countries every few years, because how do you have a family? How do you have a life,
Right.
So yeah, interdisciplinary route, however that comes about, it makes it possible to survive, because it can be quite trying. And you may get into it. You may be in it for 10 years and you've written 100 papers and you feel completely washed out. because it is incredibly, you're constantly on. There's
Yeah.
never a break. I don't take holidays. I mean, I technically take holidays, but during my holiday, I'm writing publications.
Wow.
Yeah, and for many people, including my husband, who was an academic and now is a manager at Guy's and Thomas Hospital in the analytics department,
Mm,
he just couldn't put up with it. So
right.
yeah. Sorry, it's a
So,
bit depressing.
well, no, this is important. The idea of
Mm.
preparing yourself so that you're flexible in terms of which department you can be a part of, right? That you have skill sets that can translate to multiple related departments. Again, very good practical advice. My last question, Lonely, can be a really fun one, or it
Mm.
could be a serious one, which is I like to ask all my guests, without knowing who will be on the podcast next,
Mhm.
if you had to throw a question at them, what might you ask them? So you don't have to answer it, so it can be a really tough one. But
So,
it can be anything related to the themes that we've talked about today, or maybe it's just something you're personally wondering about.
hmm. I'd really like to know what other people think about this whole, and this is it's such a selfish interest that it's because I want to know anyway. But I want to know what other people think about, especially if they're not Korean, but also if they are, but
Mm,
especially if they're not, what they
mm,
think about this system of anshim, kyushim, bunshim, and noshim,
mm,
and how they kind of like what they think about it, like they're like, is it good, is it bad, kind of basic opinion, but
mm,
also from hearing like the basic definitions, how they think that might kind of come about.
mm.
And this, as I said, it's a really selfish question, and it's more for my like, so I can steal creative ideas. But I am interested to know what
Yeah,
people think of it because it's just something that if I talk to my family about it, they're just like, "What?
yeah,
What are you talking about?"
right, right. Well, this question is meant to be a selfish question for our guests, right? For them to throw out what they're wondering about. So next time I have a guest who is familiar with these Korean ideas, I'll be sure to bring it up to them. So
Mm.
thank you, Loli. Again, I really appreciate you taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to talk to me. I
It's my
really enjoyed our
pleasure.
conversation. And I'm wondering, how can my listeners find you if they're interested in learning more about what you do? Like how can they find you online, for example?
So, I mean, I'm happy for people to contact me by email, which is loli.kim@ames.ox.ac.uk anytime. And
Mm,
I frequently get emails from students and other people who are interested in the subject. So it's very, you're very welcome. And if I don't get back to you within a week, it might be because you're lost in the
right.
email inbox. So just resend. And I apologize for that. Another way is via LinkedIn.
Mm, okay. Yeah. So
Yeah.
finding you over email or on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on other websites too, like academia.edu and ResearchGate. So, I mean, any contact is welcome. I just don't go on there as much. So,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you
Loli.
so much for having me. It's been so much fun.
It's been, I mean, incredibly helpful to chat with you about these ideas.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.